It started as a whisper, something soft, almost imperceptible, like the faint hum of a faraway engine or the sound of someone breathing too heavily in another room. I'd almost convinced myself it was just the house settling, the usual creaks and groans of old wood, when the sound became clearer. It was a scream. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I had just moved into this house a few weeks ago, an old Victorian-style home on the outskirts of town. I had always wanted a place with character, something with history. The real estate agent had warned me about the age of the house, but I wasn't put off. It was a bargain, a dream come true. There was one thing the agent hadn't mentioned, though: the sound. It wasn't constant at first. It would come and go in sporadic bursts, often when I was alone in the house, particularly at night. I thought it was the wind at first, but the more I listened, the more I realized that this wasn't any natural sound. It was too human, too desperate. Sometimes it would echo from somewhere deep within the house. Other times it felt like it was coming from the walls themselves. I checked every corner, every room, convinced that it was just my imagination or the house settling in odd ways. But then, one night, I heard it again. It was late, past midnight, and I had been awake for hours, trying to get some work done in the study. The house was silent, save for the occasional tapping of my fingers against the keyboard. That's when I heard it, the scream. This time, it was closer, almost as if it were coming from directly beneath me. I froze, my hand hovering over the keyboard. It was a woman's scream, high-pitched and blood-curdling. It was followed by a sound that seemed almost like pleading, a voice choked by terror. I immediately stood up and looked around. I checked the windows, but the night outside was still quiet. There was no one in sight. I rushed downstairs, my mind racing, the faint thudding of my heartbeat in my ears. I opened every door on the main floor, checked the back door, the windows, the closets, nothing. I even ventured into the basement, flashlight in hand, but it was empty. By the time I got back upstairs, my nerves were frayed. I needed sleep, but the sound had lingered in my mind, gnawing at me. I crawled into bed, determined to push it out of my thoughts. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I heard it again. This time it was not just a scream. It was followed by the sound of something or someone scraping against the walls. The sound was so distinct, like nails against wood, but it wasn't a single quick scrape. It dragged on, relentless. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The following morning, I called a local contractor. I didn't know what I expected. Maybe I just needed someone to tell me I wasn't crazy. I had no idea what was happening in this house, but the closer I got to confronting it, the more it felt like I was on the edge of something I didn't fully understand. The contractor arrived in the early afternoon. His name was Tony, and he was a no-nonsense type of guy. He didn't ask many questions when I explained the noises I'd been hearing. He simply nodded, took a quick look around, and started checking the house for anything out of the ordinary. "You're sure it's coming from the walls?" he asked, scratching his chin as he walked around the living room. I nodded, feeling embarrassed. I wasn't sure exactly where it came from, but the sound felt like it was coming from behind the plaster. "All right," he said, his voice gruff but calm. "I'll open up a few spots in the wall and see if there's anything causing it." As he worked, I tried to ignore the creeping sense of dread that slowly built inside me. The idea of someone or something being hidden inside the walls felt impossible. But there was something about this house that made everything feel just a little too wrong. The deeper Tony got into the wall, the more anxious I became. Hours passed and still nothing. He found nothing abnormal in the walls, no signs of pests or any structural issues. But then, just as he was about to patch up the last hole, the sound came again. This time, it was louder, much louder. A single, high-pitched scream tore through the silence, followed by more scraping. It came from the wall Tony had just been working on, and it was so clear, so visceral, that I felt my stomach turn. Tony froze, his hand hovering over the hole. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice strained. I nodded, unable to speak. I felt my pulse quicken, and a cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. Tony glanced at me, his eyes wide. I've been in this line of work for years, and I've never heard anything like this. There's something strange going on in this house. My blood ran cold. I didn't know what to say. I had hoped that maybe it was a pipe or some animal trap somewhere, but this was different. The sound, the urgency of it felt real, too real. As Tony started to step back, I heard a voice. It was faint, almost drowned out by the sound of the scraping. But it was there. "Help! Please! Help!" I gasped. The voice was so clear, so desperate. I could almost feel the presence of whoever or whatever was on the other side of the wall. Tony heard it too. He turned to me with a look of horror on his face. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice trembling. "This isn't normal. This house, it's wrong." I didn't know what to do. I wanted to leave, to escape, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to understand what was happening. There was something in this house, something trying to get out. I looked at the wall where the sound had come from, and then back at Tony. "Can you fix it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Tony shook his head. "I don't know what's causing it, but this place, it's cursed. You need to leave before it gets worse." I stood there, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. Something was inside the walls, something I couldn't explain, but as Tony left that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't done with me yet. That night, the scream returned. It wasn't just a scream anymore. It was a symphony of anguish, growing louder and more frantic. And this time, I couldn't tell if it was coming from the walls or from deep within the house itself. Every corner felt haunted. Every shadow seemed to whisper my name. The next few days blurred together. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think. Every time I closed my eyes, the scream echoed in my mind. I called Tony again, but he refused to come back. He said he wouldn't set foot in that house again. So I was alone with the scream, and it was getting louder. It was getting closer, and the longer I stayed, the more I began to wonder if I'd made a terrible mistake, if this house, this thing, had chosen me. The house felt different the next morning. Not physically, of course, but in a way I couldn't explain. The walls seemed thicker, the air heavier, as though something was pressing in from every direction. I hadn't slept a wink the night before, and the exhaustion was catching up to me. Still, I knew I couldn't leave. Not yet. It had only been a few days since the contractor had left, but already the house felt like it was becoming a part of me, like it had wrapped its fingers around my thoughts, digging into the marrow of my bones. The scream was still there, lingering in my mind, but now it was more than just a sound. It had become an entity, something that had made its home inside my head. I couldn't stop thinking about what Tony had said, that it was cursed. Maybe he was just trying to scare me, but I couldn't deny the truth of his words. Something wasn't right about this place, and I was starting to fear that leaving wouldn't stop whatever was coming. It had already settled in, like an unwanted guest that had overstayed its welcome. The worst part, I wasn't the only one who had heard it. The first night after Tony left, I reached out to a few neighbors. People in this area didn't exactly keep to themselves, but they weren't quick to offer up their lives either. Most of the houses on the street were just as old as mine, some even older, with peeling paint and sagging porches. I figured someone must have experienced something strange in their home, too. Maybe there was something in the air, something about the land itself that caused things to go. Wrong. I was right. One woman, Jean, a neighbor a few houses down, answered my knock after a few moments. She had graying hair and deep lines around her eyes, as though time had pressed down on her more than it had on anyone else. She looked at me curiously through the glass of her door. "Can I help you?" she asked, a little wary. I explained briefly what had been happening at my house, the strange noises, the screams. Jean didn't seem shocked. In fact, she looked almost relieved. "Ah," she said softly, "I thought I wasn't the only one." "Wait," I said, stepping forward. "You've heard it too?" Jean hesitated, then stepped back, allowing me inside. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. The walls, like mine, were covered in old wallpaper, faded and peeling in spots. Her living room smelled faintly of mildew, the kind of smell that only a house of a certain age seemed to have. She motioned for me to sit down on the couch while she poured a cup of tea. "Your house," Jean began, setting the cup in front of me. "It's the one on the corner, right?" I nodded. "That's where it started," she continued. Her voice was low, almost reverent, as though speaking too loudly might disturb something. "That's where the scream first came from. I'd hear it late at night, sometimes just before midnight, sometimes at dawn. The first time, I thought I was imagining it too. But then, the second time, it was different. It was louder, and it sounded like someone was right there." Jean paused, glancing at the door as if expecting someone to walk through it. "Did it start before you moved in?" I asked, my voice trembling. She shook her head. "No, I heard it after you moved in. After they finished cleaning the place up and you started settling in. It didn't start before that. At least, not to my knowledge." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. "Have you spoken to anyone else around here?" I asked, hoping for some kind of answer, something that could make sense of what was happening. Jean's lips tightened, and she leaned forward, lowering her voice. "No one else will talk about it. You ask too many questions, and people shut you out. They know about it, but they won't acknowledge it. And I wouldn't either if I were you. I'm telling you this because I think you deserve to know," but she trailed off, and I saw fear flash across her face. The kind of fear that comes from knowing something you don't want to know. "What is it? What's in that house?" Jean swallowed hard and took a slow breath before speaking again. "Not everything in this world is just an accident. There's evil here, in this place, and it's been here a long time. That scream you hear? It's not just a sound. It's a warning." I sat there, feeling the weight of her words pressing down on me. The house was quiet now, but the air in Jean's living room felt thick with unspoken truth. The house on the corner of my house had been cursed long before I arrived. "I think you need to leave," Jean said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "Whatever it is, it's not going to stop with you. It will follow you. It will keep getting worse, and it will never let go." I looked at her, confused. "What does that mean? What exactly are you saying?" She shook her head. "You don't want to know. Trust me, you don't." I stood up, unsure of what to think. The woman had given me no concrete answers, just fear and vague warnings. But there was something about her demeanor, her eyes, that made me think she knew exactly what was happening to me and what was coming next. I thanked her and left quickly, my thoughts spinning. As I walked back toward my house, I couldn't shake the feeling that Jean wasn't just worried about me. She was warning me. Something was happening here, and I was too deep in it to back out now. That night, I stayed in the house, though I didn't sleep. The silence around me felt thick, suffocating. I kept checking the windows, listening for the scrape, for the scream, but there was nothing except my own growing anxiety. Around 2 a.m., the silence was broken. The scream came again, but this time it wasn't from the walls. It was from somewhere inside the house. I ran to the hallway, scanning the dark rooms for any movement. My breath was shallow, my heart pounding in my chest. The air felt colder than usual, the temperature dropping rapidly, as though something was breathing in the dark. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something in the shadows, a figure tall and thin, standing just out of the light. Before I could react, the figure vanished into the dark, leaving only the echo of the scream. And in that moment, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The house was alive, and it was watching me. The next few days blurred into one long, terrifying cycle. I couldn't escape the house. Every time I thought about leaving, about getting away from the incessant scream that seemed to reverberate through the walls and floorboards, something in me resisted. There was a strange pull, like an invisible tether between me and the house, as though it had become part of me, and I was too far gone to break free. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, every flicker of the lights made my skin crawl. The house was watching me, listening to me. It knew when I was awake, and it knew when I was afraid. And I was afraid. The figure I'd seen that night, the one standing in the shadows, hadn't just been a trick of my eyes. I knew it now. I had seen it again, several times over the past few nights, always lurking just out of sight, always vanishing before I could get a good look. But I wasn't imagining it. It was real. Each time it appeared, I felt a cold pressure in the air, a weight on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The scream would follow, louder and more anguish than before. I knew it was connected to whatever was in this house, but I didn't know how. I didn't know what it wanted. I had no more. That's when I decided to search the house thoroughly. I had already checked every room, except for the attic, which was locked behind a thick wooden door that hadn't been opened in years. It had always been off limits to me, a place where I assumed old junk had been stashed away and forgotten. But now I wasn't so sure. I went to the door, and for the first time, I noticed something strange. The wood was old, but it wasn't warped or weathered like the other doors in the house. This door felt too solid, as if it had been recently reinforced. My heart started to race as I reached for the handle, but there was something else, something deeper in the house, telling me not to open it. But I didn't listen. I grabbed a screwdriver from the kitchen and removed the rusty screws that held the lock in place. It came off with a sharp, screeching sound, like the door itself was protesting. I paused, taking a deep breath, before slowly turning the handle and pushing the door open. The stairs leading up to the attic were narrow and steep, the wooden steps groaning beneath my weight. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mold was overpowering. But it wasn't the smell or the dust that made my blood run cold. It was the silence. The attic felt too quiet, as if something was waiting there, just out of reach. I hesitated for a moment, but then I ascended, one step at a time, my footsteps loud in the stillness. At the top of the stairs, the attic door was barely ajar, and I pushed it open. What I saw inside sent a chill through my entire body. The attic was far larger than I had imagined, the ceiling high and vaulted. There were boxes and old furniture scattered around, but something stood out in the center of the room, a large, ornate mirror. It was covered in dust, the glass cracked in several places, and the frame was carved with strange symbols that I didn't recognize. It felt wrong, out of place, like it had been waiting here for centuries. I stepped closer, my hand trembling as I wiped the dust from the glass. And then I saw it. There, reflected in the shattered mirror, was the figure. The same tall, thin shape that had been lurking in the shadows. Only now it was right there, standing behind me, its face obscured by the darkness. I spun around, but no one was there. The room was empty, silent, just as it had been moments before. I turned back to the mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure was still there, but now it was closer, its long, bony fingers reaching out toward me, its presence suffocating. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Suddenly, the air around me grew colder, and that scream, ripped through the silence, louder than it had ever been before. The walls seemed to shake with the force of it, and the glass of the mirror cracked further, splintering with an almost audible snap. I reached out, my hand shaking, and touched the cold surface of the mirror. And then everything went black. When I came to, I was no longer in the attic. I was lying on the floor of the living room, the mirror still standing where it had been in the attic, but there was no dust on it now. The glass was smooth, untouched, and the symbols on the frame were glowing faintly, as if alive. I pushed myself to my feet, feeling dizzy and disoriented. The house felt different, somehow. The air was thicker, heavier, as if something had changed. And that's when I saw it. In the reflection of the mirror, standing just behind me, was the figure. But this time, it wasn't just a shadow. It had a face, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me, as though it could see everything I was hiding. Its mouth was open, and I could hear it, that scream, only now it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the mirror. I turned, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. I turned back to the mirror, and the figure was still there, watching me. Its mouth moved, but no sound came from it. The reflection seemed to distort, like the glass itself was bending around the shape, twisting it into something else, something more grotesque. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. Was this all some kind of hallucination? A trick of the light? Or was this thing, this creature, truly real? The mirror felt real. The figure felt real. I ran out of the room, my breath ragged, my mind in a panic. The house felt oppressive now, like it was closing in around me. Every step I took felt heavier, like the floor itself was pulling me down, dragging me back into the depths of whatever nightmare I had unleashed. I had to leave. I had to get out. But I couldn't. Not yet. The mirror, it was calling to me. I knew that somehow it held the key to what was happening in this house. What was behind it? What the scream meant? And I had a sinking feeling that I wasn't going to escape this thing just by running. I was already trapped. The house felt like a cage now, its walls pressing in on me from all sides. I had tried to leave, but every time I stepped outside, the weight in my chest would grow unbearable, the scream from the mirror echoing in my ears, drawing me back. There was no escape. It wasn't just the mirror anymore. That was just the surface. The figure, That thing lurking in the shadows and behind the glass had taken hold of my mind. I could feel it watching me, even when I wasn't looking directly at it. It was like it was living inside me, a part of me I couldn't shake. I couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? Jean had warned me, but she had been too cryptic, too afraid to tell me the full truth. And now I understood why. The mirror wasn't just a mirror. It was a doorway. And the thing behind it wasn't just a figure. It was a presence, something ancient, something that had been here long before I arrived. The house had been built over something old, something that should have been left undisturbed. Whatever it was, whatever had been awakened, it was feeding on my fear, drawing me deeper into its grasp. I tried to avoid the attic, but the pull was too strong. I had to know more. I spent days pacing around the house, looking for any clue, any scrap of information that might explain what was happening. I searched the old bookshelves, the hidden corners of the house where dust had settled and memories had been forgotten. But there was nothing, no record, no journal, nothing that could explain the horrors I was experiencing. Then, late one night, as the moonlight spilled through the broken window panes, I found it. It was tucked away in the back of a closet, hidden beneath an old pile of tattered blankets. A journal. It was small, leather-bound, and worn from age. I hesitated for only a moment before I opened it, my heart pounding as I skimmed the first few pages. The handwriting was barely legible, the ink faded and smudged. But as I read, the words became clearer, and a story began to form, a story that chilled me to the bone. The house has always been a place of whispers. The people who lived here before us knew the stories, the legends, the curses. But they were weak, foolish, and they thought they could escape what they had awakened. It started with the mirrors. There are things that live in the glass, in the reflections, things that feed on what we cannot see. They are ancient, older than the house itself. And when you open the door, when you step into the light, you awaken them. I've seen it. It came to me in the dark, in the silence. It is not just a thing. It is a presence. It wants more than to be seen. It wants to consume. My stomach twisted as I read those words. The journal was written by someone who had lived in this house long before I did. Someone who had experienced the same things I was now going through. But they had known more. They had known the truth, and they had paid the price for it. The mirror was a doorway, yes, but it wasn't just a way for the figure to get to me. It was a portal to something worse, something older, and it had been waiting for me. I needed to leave. I had to leave. But as I closed the journal and pushed it aside, I heard it again, the scream. This time, it wasn't just an echo in my mind. It was real. It was coming from upstairs. I grabbed the journal and rushed to the attic, my heart pounding. Each step up the creaky stairs felt like it was dragging me further into some unseen trap. I reached the top and found the door to the attic was wide open, the dark space beyond beckoning me in. The mirror stood in the center of the room, just as it had been before. But now it was different. The glass shimmered, like the surface of water disturbed by an unseen force, rippling and warping. And in the reflection, I could see something new. It was the figure, but it wasn't alone. Behind it, stretching out of the mirror like shadows in the dark, were dozens of other shapes. They were tall and thin, just like the figure, but these were not just shadows. They were faces, horrible, twisted faces that stared back at me with hollow eyes. They were watching me, waiting, and I knew, without a doubt, that they were the ones screaming. I stepped forward, but before I could reach the mirror, the door slammed shut behind me. locking me in. I was trapped. I tried to break it down, to escape, but it was useless. The walls were closing in on me, and I could feel the air growing colder. My breath came in shallow gasps, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. I was so close to breaking free, but the mirror, that thing, pulled me in. I could feel it, like a force, like an invisible hand reaching out from the reflection. The scream came again, louder this time, as if it was inside the room with me. My legs gave out beneath me, and I fell to the floor, gasping for air. My eyes were locked on the mirror, unable to look away. The figure stepped forward, its long, bony hand reaching out toward me. And then I saw it in the reflection. The door behind me, the one I had just closed, was wide open. It wasn't supposed to be open. I spun around, heart racing. But there was nothing there. Just the empty attic. No door, no escape. Only the figure and the faces behind it. They're coming for me. I scrambled backward, my heart pounding in my chest, but it was too late. I could feel the presence behind me, closing in. The mirror was alive, and it was pulling me into it, pulling me into the dark. And then the figures stepped out of the mirror, their eyes hollow and full of hunger, their mouths opening in silent screams that tore at the air. The last thing I remember was the cold fingers touching my arm. The scream was deafening, echoing through the house, and everything went dark. When I woke up, I was outside. The house was gone. The street was empty, but I could still hear the scream. And I knew then, with a terrible certainty, that I had not escaped. It was inside me now. The scream, the darkness, the thing in the mirror, it had followed me. I don't know how long it's been since I woke up outside the house. Time no longer makes sense to me. I've tried to leave, but I can never seem to get far enough away. Every time I try, the pull is too strong, like invisible hands wrapping around my chest and dragging me back. I know that if I stay long enough, I'll be drawn back to that place. The house, the mirror, the scream. I can hear it now, even as I sit here in this room. It's not a physical sound, but it's there, gnawing at the edges of my mind, just out of reach, like the faintest whisper or the distant rumble of thunder. It's inescapable, and it won't stop. I've tried to tell people. I've tried to explain what happened, but no one believes me. They look at me like I'm insane, and maybe I am. Maybe that's what it's done to me, twisted my mind until I can't tell where reality ends and the nightmare begins. But I know what I've seen. I know it's real. That house, it's not just a place. It's a trap, a prison, a place where the line between life and death blurs, where the darkness hides things that should never be seen. I've learned that much. I don't know if anyone ever lived there before me. I don't know if they made it out alive. But I know what happens to people who get too close, too curious. They become part of it. They become the scream. I still hear the scream. I don't know why I returned to the house that day. I had promised myself I wouldn't go back. But the dreams had gotten worse. The whispers in the back of my mind, the feeling of being watched. Every night, I would wake up drenched in sweat, the sound of the scream ringing in my ears. And every night, it would be a little louder. So I went back. The house stood there, just as it had been, dilapidated and broken, the windows' empty eyes staring out at me. But something was different. The air was heavier, the shadows darker. I could feel it pulling me in, calling me closer. I walked up the front steps, the old wood creaking under my weight. As I reached for the doorknob, I hesitated. I had been here before. I knew what was waiting inside, but I couldn't stop myself. The door opened with a low groan, and I stepped inside. The house was silent, but not for long. I walked through the rooms, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. Each room looked exactly as I remembered it, familiar and yet not. There was a sense of unease in the air, as if the house was aware of my presence, aware of my every movement. And then I heard again the scream, faint at first, but growing louder with every step I took. I knew where it was coming from. The attic. I made my way up the stairs, the sound of my breathing the only thing that filled the silence. The door to the attic creaked open, and I stepped inside, the air colder than before, the darkness thicker. And there, in the center of the room, was the mirror. But it wasn't the same mirror I remembered. It was larger, more imposing. The cracks in the glass had widened, and the symbols on the frame glowed faintly, like they were alive. And in the reflection, I saw it again. The figure. It was no longer just a shadow, no longer just a presence. It had a form, a face. It wasn't human. It was something twisted, something grotesque. The eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to swallow everything around them. The mouth was stretched wide in an eternal scream, a scream that I could hear echoing in my mind, louder and louder. And it was coming for me. I stepped forward, mesmerized, unable to tear my eyes away from the reflection. The figure reached out, its long, bony fingers brushing the surface of the glass. I reached out, too, drawn by the same force that had pulled me here. The glass rippled like water disturbed by a stone. I could feel it, the cold, the darkness, the pressure building around me. And then, before I knew what was happening, my fingers touched the mirror. The world around me shifted. I stumbled backward, disoriented, and looked around in confusion. The attic was gone. The house was gone. I was in the dark. It was suffocating, the air thick and heavy, as though I was underwater, struggling to breathe. I reached out, my hand brushing against something soft and wet. A sound echoed through the darkness, a low, guttural moan, followed by the faintest whisper, "You shouldn't have come." I turned, but there was nothing there, only darkness. And then I heard the scream again. It wasn't just in my mind this time. It was real. It was around me, surrounding me, pressing in on all sides. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, whether it was from inside my head or from somewhere deeper, somewhere darker. But it was relentless, a tidal wave of sound, of terror, drowning me. I screamed, but no sound came out. I tried to run, but the darkness wrapped around me, pulling me deeper into it. My legs gave out beneath me, and I fell, tumbling through the dark abyss. And then everything stopped. I woke up. It was quiet now. The scream had stopped, but something was wrong. I was no longer in the dark. I was in a room, a small, dimly lit room. I could hear the faintest sound, like the wind outside, rustling through the trees. But the house, it was gone. Or maybe it was never really gone at all. I looked around the room, and then I saw it. The mirror. It was standing in the corner, the reflection warped and broken. And in the glass, I could see it again, the figure watching me with those hollow eyes. But now there was something else. A face behind the figure, staring out at me from the depths of the glass. It was mine. I screamed, and the scream never faded. The house is still here. It never left, and neither will I.